Political liberalism is the second major work of Rawls's career. Together with the theory of justice, political liberalism and the theory of justice really form Rawls's view. When people talk about a Rawlsian conception of anything, they're really talking about these two works. He wrote a lot of other things, but these are really his two most important and influential works. In political liberalism, what the question that Rawls is concerned with is, what is the shared basis for organizing social and political affairs? What should the shared basis that we all have in common in society? What should that shared basis be? What is that shared basis from which we can all agree to structure political and social affairs? And you might think, well, I thought we kind of talked about that with the theory of justice, and you'd be absolutely correct, because eventually where Rawls is going to be coming around to what his answer is going to be, what is the shared basis for structuring our institutions, for structuring society, and so on? He's ultimately going to say, well, yeah, what I talk about in the theory of justice kind of fits that description. It can do that, right? And so the theory of justice that you get in a theory of justice is in certain ways going to be the solution, or the answer, I should say, to this question. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's start where Rawls starts. So political liberalism is concerned with a certain problem. And this is what he opens up with. Now, I don't think he calls it this, but I'm going to call it the problem of reasonable pluralism. The way he states it is something like this. How is it possible for there to be a stable and just society of citizens who are free and equal, but who are also profoundly divided by reasonable, philosophic, religious, and moral doctrines? How is that possible? Rawls wants to say that is indeed what we find in the United States in particular, but I think he'd want to say in many countries throughout the world, many liberal democratic countries throughout the world, if that's what he's going to be particularly concerned with. We do in fact find a stable and just society of citizens who are free and equal, but are nonetheless profoundly divided. Let me say a couple words about this. So the first thing you might think is stable and just society. That's not the United States at all, right? That seems crazy, especially, kind of given recent events and recent history with the injustice of, their kind of unjust police killings and so on. Kind of racism in the society, and then the kind of some of the reactions to that have been these protests, and then some of these protests have themselves then become violent, and you've had things like looting and so on. And how could you call this a stable and just society? I think the first thing to consider is history. Compared to what you find throughout human history, there is a remarkable stability in 20th and 21st century American political life, in American society. That's not to say everything is stable and everything's, hunky-dory and everyone's getting well just fine and there's no problems and there can be protests and things like that, and there can be violence and there can be injustice, but compared to other human societies, one of the most remarkable features of modern liberal democratic societies is their stability. And I think Rawls would want to say also the justice that you find compared to other societies, compared to the way things used to be. We've had protests, even stronger, looting, even stronger. People have killed each other. over political divide. So the two most maybe famous examples would be in Charlottesville, when that guy took his car through a crowd of protesters and killed a young woman because she was protesting the white supremacist march or whatever. She was protesting white supremacy, and someone sympathetic to that cause killed her with his car, right? Killed her over a political issue. And then more recently, in I believe it was Portland, there was a self-identified Antifa member who shot and killed a Trump supporter. Or the exact details, but I know he belonged to some particular group, and I don't know the exact details of that group, but something like that, right? People being killed over political differences. So you might think, well, how is that a stable society? And again, I would say compare it to other societies. What has happened? Yeah, so the killing of people over political opinions is very bad. Very bad. But there is remarkably less of that than there really has been throughout human history. Those things, as bad as they are thankfully somewhat, they're aberrations. That's not the normal course of things. They make news and make news for a long time when they happen. Whereas you go back in human history and things like that were far more common, right? Just look at just pick any other century you like. Pick the 17th century and go look at various countries and things that were happening. Kings beheaded, governments totally toppled. We need a new government now. Religious wars and so on, right? People killing each other, having a war over religion. Multiple people dying, people being massacred, genocides over religion. We don't have, thankfully, things like that in our society. Our society is comparatively stable. Moreover, I think Rawls want to say is comparatively just. It doesn't, I'm sure in certain classes you do much more of this, but you go back and read anything, basically, that was written more than 40 years ago, and you're going to find people saying sexist, racist things. That's not to say sexism and racism and other kinds of prejudice have been completely eliminated from society. Obviously, they haven't. But it is to say that it was worse back in the day. And I think this is Rawls's idea, right? And so we have a comparatively just society. He's not saying it's perfect. He's not saying there's no room for work or whatever. How can we have a society that's more or less stable and more or less just, right? With all the qualifications I've just built in, how can you have a society like that when you have people who are profoundly divided? And those divides have come up in some of the things I've just been talking about, some of these protests and so on. But what Rawls is really thinking about is like, look, you have in American society in particular, it's a very diverse society. America is a very diverse country. And a lot of that diversity, or some of that diversity, has to do with the fact you have a lot of Christians over there who devoutly believe their particular brand of Christianity. And you have other Christians who devoutly believe a different brand of Christianity. And the same thing can be said of Muslims, right? And so then you have like a bunch of, you have Muslims over there with their brand of Islam. You have Muslims over there with their brand of Islam. And then they all disagree with the Christians, and the Christians disagree with them. And then you can throw Jews into the mix, and there's Buddhists, and and then there's people who think it's all ridiculous, right? That religions are, whatever. I don't know what people would say, for foolish people or something. They might not be that mean about it, but right, you have atheists or agnostics who aren't religious at all. These commitments are the deepest commitments that people tend to have, right? You talk to a devout Muslim about what's most important to them, what their deepest, strongest commitments are. It's going to be stuff related to their faith. Likewise with devout Jews, devout Christians, devout members of any religion, and people who are atheists or agnostic, not all of them. And then and you have lukewarm Muslims and Christians and Jews too, right? And and you have lukewarm or whatever atheists or agnostics who just don't really care. But you do get atheists and agnostics who do really care, and who would say, yeah, it's like really part of my worldview that there's no God. And I really think that all these people trying to affect policy and so on in light of their I think that's horrible. And this is really important to me, right? Profound divisions over philosophic, religious, and moral doctrines. The most important things in these people's lives, they are divided about. How is it that we don't have religious wars? How is it that we can come together and structure society in a way that we can all, in some sense or other, get on board with and agree to, when our views on the world are so different from one another, right? And our most important values are different from other people's most important, cherished values. How can we have any kind of stability? How can we get along and do things together when we are so profoundly divided? How is that possible? That's a problem. That's a puzzle. How on earth can we do that? Why haven't we just devolved into religious wars or whatever the kind of wars you like? That's what Rawls is trying to address in political liberalism. And his solution, we can have a society like this if the society is structured around what he calls a political conception of justice. And so what we're going to try to do is understand what a political conception of justice is, what it entails for how citizens should behave when they're engaging in the public square. And to understand that, we're going to need to go through some of Rawls's kind of technical terminology. And so in particular, what we're going to have to look at is this idea that he has of reasonable comprehensive doctrines. So we're going to look at reasonable comprehensive doctrines, then we're going to look at this political conception of justice, and then we're going to finish by considering what this means for how we're supposed to behave in the public square.